This video was prepared by members of the Warrington Township Historic Commission to be used by schools, civic groups, and members of the community to introduce them to the historic nature of the township. Warrington Township was founded by a court order in October 1734. It included an area north and west of Warminster Township. Since the township is more than 265 years old, it is only reasonable to expect that there are many historic buildings within its borders. The present township building, shown here, was built and occupied in 1993. The video is divided into two parts. The first will show 17 buildings located in every section of the township. These represent only about 25% of all the recognized structures, but they constitute a reasonable cross-section of the entire group. The second part of the video will be devoted to showing and describing all of the schools, past and present, in the township. As we leave the township building, we go next door to 850 Easton Road, the Nathaniel Irwin House. The original house on this property was built in 1736 and was called Mansion House. A Philadelphia merchant bought the house in 1777 and rented it to Nathaniel Irwin, who was minister of the Neshaminy Presbyterian Church in Warwick. Reverend Irwin bought the house in 1785. Later, the house was torn down and Reverend Irwin built a larger house on the original foundation in 1809. This is the house that you now see across from the Doylestown Hospital Wellness Center. Reverend Irwin sold the house in 1823, and it went through a series of owners until 1865. In that year, Richard J. Dobbins purchased it, and it remained in the family's possession until 1939. The house was completely restored in the 1980s by attorney Randolph Scott, who now uses it as a professional office. Our next stop is 1754 Costner Drive, which is off Valley Road, south of Street Road. The original owners of the house were the Penrose and Paul families. It is located in the area of the township known as Paul Valley. A date stone at the site indicates that a building was erected there in 1719, but the present house was built in 1819. Legend has it that both the mother and daughter of the original owners died in the same room in the home within one day of each other. Some say that this has resulted in the house being considered haunted. When the current owners, Joseph and Rebecca Bernardo, purchased the house, it had been vandalized and had no windows, doors, or solid roof. It has been restored as much as possible to its original appearance from using old photographs obtained from previous owners. We retrace our route on Valley Road to the bridge crossing the Neshaminy Creek. A narrow road leads us back to 854 Valley Road, known as the Old Mill Farm. The building was originally a grist mill constructed by Robert Tompkins in 1756. He also built a sawmill, and the two were operated under the name of the Long Merchant Mill. The name came from Andrew Long, who came to this area from Ireland in 1691. During the American Revolution, the mill supplied flour and meal to George Washington when he had his headquarters at the Moreland House in nearby Warwick Township. The mill was converted to a residence in 1936 and has had a number of owners until the present day. Restoration of the house was completed in 1999 by Arthur and Kim Hines, the present owners. Continuing on Valley Road to Bristol Road, we turn left and find an interesting homestead at 1760 Bristol Road. The house was initially built between 1760 and 1765 by Andrew Long, the son of the Andrew Long mentioned in talking about the grist mill. Andrew Long Sr. bought 400 acres of land in 1735. This house occupies part of that property. Members of the Long family owned the house continually until the 1930s. Two additions were added to the house, one in the early 1800s and the other in the early 1900s. At one point during the Revolutionary War, one room in the original house was used as a hospital. Moving along to the corner of Bristol and Easton Roads, we find the Hatboro Federal Savings Bank. This building was constructed as a residence by John Barclay, who was an important man in the early years of this country. He devoted many years to public service. When he built the house in 1799, he intended to spend the rest of his life in it, but when his wife died, he moved to Philadelphia. In 1804, Barclay sold the house to Benjamin Hoff, whose family owned it for 51 years. Hoff's nephew, Ulysses S. Grant, visited his uncle there several times. Grant, of course, was a famous Civil War general and later President of the United States. The bank purchased the building in 1963 and has preserved the kitchen with its colonial furnishings. We turn right on Easton Road and head north. In a short distance, we find 1450 Easton Road. This building is a relative newcomer in comparison to the others you have seen, having been built in 1920. The house was a prepackaged building purchased from the Aladdin Company. It was shipped with each piece numbered in a railroad boxcar to Doylestown. It was then assembled at its present location by Luther Nash, a Doylestown contractor. It was not planned to be electrified, but electricity came into the area while it was being built. Consequently, this house was one of the first houses in Warrington to have electric lights. The house was originally owned by Charles Murray, the great-grandfather of Frank Shelley, the present owner, so the house has been in the same family for over 80 years. At the bottom of the Warrington Hill on Easton Road, on the northern boundary of the township, sits Broadlawn. This house is hardly visible from the highway because of all the trees that surround it. The property on which it sits was bought by the Greer family in 1770 and included 31 acres at the foot of Greer's Hill, now known as Warrington Hill. James Greer, who was born in 1820, built the Victorian mansion in 1880. After having been vacant for 12 years, it was bought by Dr. and Mrs. John Prickett in 1945. They hired an architect to renovate and preserve the house. The latest owner was Martha Prickett, their daughter, who died recently. We turn onto Kelly Road and proceed to 1581 Stuckert Road. This property stands at the corner of Stuckert and Warwick Roads. The original part of the house was built around the year 1810 by the Stuckert family, for whom the road was named. A map from the 1840s shows farmland belonging to the Stuckerts and other families. The farm occupied land all the way back to Guinea Lane and was still being farmed in the 1930s by a tenant farmer. The house, which has been owned since 1982 by David and Linda Price, has deep walls, detailed woodwork, and old door fixtures representative of the early 1800s. Coming back to Bristol Road, we cross Easton Road and continue on past Barness Field. Next to Barness is 2796 Bristol Road. Sitting on an 11-acre property, the house was built in 1856 by a family named Cowans. On the right-hand side of the house, above the windows, there is a date stone showing the year 1856. The house has 7 fireplaces, 6 of which are stone. The current owners are Paul and Beth Koob, who bought it in 1997. It is believed that the house served as a station on the Underground Railroad before and during the Civil War. The Underground Railroad was a series of homes in the north where slaves who had escaped from their masters in the south were hidden and cared for during their trips to Canada. Continuing on Bristol Road to 3298, we come to a house owned by Kenneth Miller and Gretchen Castle. Property searches date the house as having been built in 1820, but property records go back to the mid-1700s. There is evidence that an older, smaller house once stood on the property. A short distance further on Bristol Road brings us to the Mill Creek Farm, owned by Harry and Peg Garton since 1955. The land on which the farm stands was once part of New Britain Township, but it was annexed by Warrington Township in 1849. The earliest owner was William Allen, dating back to the early 1700s. He sold the property to Robert Walker, who built a house, probably not the present one, and cleared the land. The present house was built in and about 1790 and consisted of only 2 rooms. Throughout the years, 3 rooms were added as well as a second floor to the whole house. We next travel across Lower State Road to Pickertown Road and turn onto Mill Creek Road. There are 2 old houses which sit far back off the road and are reached by one road. The house which you are looking at now is owned by Thomas and Cynthia Knotts and was originally built in 1790. Additions were constructed around 1840 and again in 1980. This means that this house has had parts built in 3 different centuries. We continue on to Limekiln Pike and head back toward County Line Road. On our left, we see the beautiful stone church, the Pleasantville United Church of Christ, which was built in 1898. This is the oldest church in the township. The congregation for this church was actually formed in 1840, and they erected a church that was known as the Little Red Brick Church in the Woods. That church was replaced by the present structure, which is noted for its beautiful stained glass windows. Over the years, through various mergers, the congregation became the Pleasantville Reformed Church, then the Pleasantville Evangelical Reformed Church, and finally the present name, Pleasantville United Church of Christ. Our next stop is 3263 County Line Road at the old farmhouse owned and occupied by Robert and Jane Henderson. The house was built by Mrs. Henderson's great-great-grandfather in the early 1820s as a home for his new bride. The house was originally 1 story, but later a complete second floor was added. This house has been in the possession of one family for over 180 years, probably the longest of any house in the township. Continuing on County Line Road, we come to a house at the corner of Bradford Avenue. This stone home, owned by Richard and Stacy Feldman, was built around 1750. It had previously been owned more than 30 years ago by Mr. Feldman's mother and aunt. The house had a number of distinguishing features which helped to date it. In the attic, the rafters are identified using Roman numerals, and the foundation itself sits on 12 wooden trees. There is a spring house next to the back door, which is in perfect condition. The Feldmans have found many interesting objects on the property, including at least one coin dating from the 1800s. At the corner of Folly and Street Road stands a house owned by William and Dot McNaney for over 35 years. The house was built around 1810 and was owned by members of the McNair family from 1843 to 1921. The McNairs were among the original Scotch-Irish settlers in the area, dating back from about 1732, just before Warrington was incorporated. Making a left turn onto Street Road, we see on the right a beautiful Victorian farmhouse. Robert Service bought 26 acres in 1850 from John McNair, a member of the family just mentioned. In 1875, he built the house we now see. The property was sold to Jacob Perry in 1890. Jacob passed the property on to his son Sherman, who in turn left it to his daughter Marge Porter and her son. It was sold to the present owner, Herman Geerlings, in the early 1990s. The farm, which in recent years is used to grow corn, now comprises 48 acres. This concludes the tour of historic buildings. Remember, these represent only about 25% of all our historic sites. If you ride around the township, you will see many of the others and recognize them by the historic plaques seen near the front doors.